So you went on to Billing High School, which was a progressive, physics and geography, was it? Yeah.
That's right, yes.
And 1970, they actually got, in 1971, in fact, the Met Office got an IBM 360 195, a big system indeed. So you decided to have a look at the Met Office, did you? Why? Because it because it was interested in weather.
Yeah, I mean, the main driver for me was the weather. But little did I know that, you know, to do all the weather forecasting and processing at that time, I thought it was a manual process, but it turns out that they were introducing computers around the time where I was leaving school. They got this 360 195 IBM machine, which was one of the most powerful computers in the world at the time. And in fact, they ran the first computer models for atmospheric simulation on that machine. Very small scale, of course, but they were quite sophisticated for the time and leading the game in terms of computerized weather forecasting. And yeah, so joining the Met Office at that point in time, in 1979, they were really ramping up how they were using that machine. And not only were they using it for weather forecasting, but they were using it for climate data digitization, which, you know, that huge history of climate data has been generated over the years since the 1850s, and that was all being digitized onto magnetic tape. And that was one of my first jobs, actually, to look after the archive, the digitized archive, and manage the tape archive that it was being put onto.
So were they actually putting onto tape the original records of that original? It wasn't called the Meteorological Office, the Met Office, under Admiral Robert Fitzroy. Were they really doing that?
There were two ways of tackling that digitization. One went back to the 1920s, where data from logs and ships' logs, marine data, was punched onto punched cards, holorith cards, and that continued right up to the 1960s, I think. But once they got the digital computers, the electronic digital computers, that there was because of course the punch card system was a mechanical system and a very archaic way of data processing. But once they got the electronic digital computers of the 1960s and 70s, the approach to data processing completely changed, and it was done at scale. So they started to not only punch data from records directly on specialized computer systems that allowed teams of people to basically key in information from forms by visually translating it and using a keyboard into digitized form, but they'd also got this archive back to the 1920s of punch cards, which they also digitized into electronic form by using card readers and so on. So, you know, there were two channels of data flow coming in to the archives at that point.
And they were using this to look for patterns, were they?
So the data, yeah, obviously, you know, going back even back to the 1850s, there was analog computing going on at the Met Office, and you know, Professor Galton and his colleagues were developing mechanical machines to process data and do analysis of daily patterns and you know, behavior of climate over longer periods of time. And that has actually, you know, that early work has fed into the sort of modeling that we do today in a very loose way, but obviously everything's digitized now, so it's much easier to write more sophisticated models than it is to write write programs, if you like, that control mechanical machines. So
now let me just put my big toe in the water of meteorology and try and explain it to you. You tell me where I'm wrong.
yeah.
Presumably you get better results if your model is correct. So let's just put that to aside for a moment, the model. But also the data that you collect. One is the right type of data: wind speed, pressure, temperature, sunlight, those types of things, time as well.
Yeah.
One, the right type, and it's accurate. Two, it's in a little cell. It's in a small area. If you have the average sunshine or average temperature for the whole of the UK, that's not going to tell you what's going to happen in Brighton necessarily. And so the more granular you can have it, the better it is. Is that basically right?
In terms of forecasting, the geographical area that's covered has obviously increased from the early days, where it was very, very oriented towards the UK, and we now do global modelling. And for each, okay, so it's very difficult to describe how a model works really, just without visual material to help, but I'll try and describe it. If you imagine a grid that covers the entire surface of the Earth,
yeah,
at each intersection of the verticals and horizontal lines of that grid, and the grid spacing can be kilometers or tens of kilometers, depending on the resolution. At each intersection point, you can forecast the parameters that you've described previously: wind speed, temperature, humidity, and a whole range of other parameters get forecasted these days in the very sophisticated models that we run. And that's done on a global scale and in more detail, in more condensed form, and much higher resolution over certain areas of the world, like the UK, for example, and Europe. And that is presented in digitized form through various channels to the media and for specialist consumers like aviation and so on. And they all have different requirements. So aviation, for example, would be more interested in what's going on at the higher levels of the atmosphere as opposed to what's going on at the surface. And so we do vertical forecasting as well as the points on the surface grid. So if you imagine different layers in the atmosphere, different grids on top of the surface grid going up for each point there, you've got a vertical representation of that data as well. And that basically means there's a whole load of data. And the more you increase the resolution of those models, the more data you've got to process. Right. And the aim is to process that in the minimal time so that people get a good forecast out at the end.